Hello, welcome to this presentation on elderhood in human development Christian formation. Today's video presentation is really intended for two different audiences. First of all, this is a class presentation for my class, Human Development and Christian Formation at AMBS, Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. But it is also something I'm going to be sharing with our congregation at Joy Mennonite Church this Sunday in lieu of a regular Sunday sermon. And I'm hoping that after this presentation that we can have some kind of discussion together on the subject. So first, for my viewers at Joy Mennonite, I want to give a brief introduction. Because in this class, we've been studying the idea of human development, how human beings grow and change during the different stages of life. While psychology, physiology, sociology, those things are important parts of this inquiry, we are also considering these concepts in the context of faith. In other words, how do our faith journeys as human beings change and evolve during the different stages of our development? In this class, one of our assignments is that we were given the task of exploring one of the stages of human development. Some of these stages include early childhood, the time of babies, young adulthood, middle age. But for my assignment, and also one of my other classmates, we've been given the assignment of elderhood. And so this is what this presentation is about today, but specifically in the context of the community of faith. Or to say it another way, I want to explore a little bit of what we as a faith community, both in my class and in my church, what we should understand about our elders. First, I want to talk a little bit about some of the theories of faith development. In our class, through our readings, we looked at several different theories of faith development. And as well as that, I looked at some books, I looked at some journal articles, and if I wanted to grossly simplify these theories, these different ideas, and again, this is a gross simplification, most of these authors did a much better job of nuancing these ideas than I'm going to write here now. But for the sake of discussion, I would argue they really fell into two main categories. First of all, first oversimplification is this. Elderhood is a time of misery and woe, a time of calamity when human beings suffer the aging of their bodies and minds, the loss of loved ones, the loss of career, and the loss of purpose. The purpose of the church is to help our elders cope with these changes. Rather bleak, rather dark. But that's the majority of a lot of the literature I found, particularly of a practical nature, focused on those kind of issues. The second viewpoint is that elderhood is a time of graduation, when we ideally have graduated from many of the cares and concerns of the earlier stages of life and are now free in new ways to be the human beings we were born to be. The purpose of the church is to support our elders in this process, but also to listen to the elders when they share their wisdom with us and to be open to their continuing active presence in our lives. On this second viewpoint, let me reach over here real quick. The best book that I think shares in this idea, shucks, I do not have it handy, but it's a book by Richard Rohr. This talks about falling forward. The idea of second half of life spirituality is a really good book on this idea. But anyway, the reality of these two viewpoints, and bear in mind again, these are grossly oversimplified, is that both of these views are right in a way. And certainly when looking at the first viewpoint, we need to be there to help folks, whether they're young or old, through the hard parts of life. And I think much of the literature, especially that of a practical nature, written for those doing ministry with elders, focuses on this viewpoint, and there's some value to that. At the same time, I think negatively, we can lose out on some powerful ministry by our elders when we focus solely on this viewpoint. Because what ends up happening too often is that our elders are ignored. They're pushed aside. They are seen as people we minister to rather than possibly our most effective ministers. But I also have to say I'm biased on this issue because I'm a peace activist in Oklahoma City. Since my first days of involvement in the movements for peace and justice in this community, I have been very, very aware of who shows up. Who shows up at the protests against war, to vigils at the governor's mansion on execution days, to meetings of committees engaged in work for social change, and to all the other practical nitty-gritty work that's involved when doing work for justice in this city. Largely, it is the elders who show up. Now, I'm not saying there aren't young people involved. There are, and a growing number, which is encouraging. But for the most part, those people who have been in it for the long haul are the older folks. And because of that, I have seen through their example what it means to live a life of activism. And frankly, I have suffered when I neglected to hear their wisdom. One of the folks we'll be interviewing a little bit, Sadie Mast, she's told me repeatedly, do what you can, but don't do too much. One of the times in my life, many times in life I failed is when I didn't listen to that advice. I tried to do too much. I think that for all of us, we have a lot to learn from our elders. And so I think for this presentation, I think one of the best ways we can understand what this stage of life is really about, but particularly when it comes to the issue of faith development, is to hear from the elders themselves. I chose two people to interview, Sadie Mast and Marianne Mertens. We'll be hearing from them in a moment. But now I'd like to introduce to you Sadie Mast. Sadie grew up in the Amish church in Iowa. In her late 20s, she met her future husband Moses, also Amish from Oklahoma, while working at a school for indigenous youth in northern Canada. They married and later made their way to the Mennonite church. They continued to live in Canada for many years, adopting two sons, before moving to Oklahoma. Moses worked as a carpenter, but also as a minister during these years. He's been pretty much bivocational his whole life. In the early 1980s, Sadie and Moses joined with other people of faith to build a long-standing ecumenical peace and justice movement here in Oklahoma City. Key players in this movement included the Benedictine Sisters, the Oklahoma City Peace House, as well as a variety of people from various religious backgrounds. This movement has worked on many issues over the years, but in the early days, it was the American-sponsored atrocities in Central America, with the resulting refugee crisis, that took most of their attention. Then in 1987, Moses and Sadie, at that time were serving at Spencer, Oklahoma Mennonite Church, when they were asked by Mennonite Central Committee to serve in a Salvadoran refugee camp in Honduras. I believe the community was San Marcos, Honduras. This experience changed their lives. And I have a few pictures here of sharing that shows from when the daily newspaper here in Oklahoma City that talked about their experiences. Upon returning to Oklahoma, Moses and Sadie were next called to serve as the interim pastors of a struggling church plant in Oklahoma City, Joy Mennonite Church. This church, not long after, began meeting in what used to be the VS Volunteer Service House here in Oklahoma City, and we've been here ever since. As it turned out, though, this interim assignment became permanent, and Moses and Sadie served as our pastors from 1991 to 2007. It was during this time that I first met Sadie, when I got to visit with her during a peace protest in Oklahoma City. There in the street corner, I found that there was a church that believed in peace, and that I didn't have to that I could actually go there and not have to hide what I believed about war. And a few months later, when I had to part ways with my old church, I found a new spiritual home at Joy Mennonite, and it's been my home ever since. So because of that, since 2004, Moses and Sadie have been my mentors in ministry, but I also call them my unofficial grandparents. Moses and Sadie continue to this day to be long-standing workers for peace, serving in a variety of ways. On the Central States MCC Board, the Oklahoma MCC Relief Cell, the Center for Conscience and Action, formerly the Oklahoma Center for Conscience, and the Oklahoma Conference of Churches, just to name a few. But their work really is less about the organizations and more about very practical things, about how they live their lives. Little things, like the garden they plant at their house, simple way that they live. and especially the ways that they mentor the young. They have encouraged and mentored a whole new generation of workers for peace and justice in Oklahoma. And some of the pictures you've been seeing show some examples of these folks at work. Sadie's now in her 80s. She's still very active and still is ministering to others every day. So I wanted to talk with her a little bit about her spiritual journey. There we go. Well, Sadie, could you tell me a little bit about what are the spiritual practices that are helpful to you in your journey and connecting to God? And
well, I guess mine goes back to when I was just a little girl.
Mm-hmm.
I often tell this to people. I don't know if this is quite what you want or not, but my father was a bishop in the Amish church. I grew up Amish, and I'd sit out on the cement step, watch for that first star to come up. Star light, star bright, for star seed and night. And my wish was always to be what God wants me to be when I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
But now, I just don't get finish learning. I mean, I'm still learning even at my age. The more I learn about God, the more I realize how little we do know about God or the mysteries of God.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm.
And for me also, I don't read prayers or go by the prayer book or anything like that. Mine is more meditation and thanking God for everything rather than asking God to do this or that.
Mm-hmm.
God knows more than He knows what we need, but just to be in fellowship with Him and feel His presence and knowing.
Now, I know you've told me before that sometimes when you can't sleep in the night that you'll pray. What is that like? What kind of things do you pray about, or how do you pray?
It's more thinking about all the people that are suffering or people that are not suffering. Just God bless them. And that they could feel God's presence near.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I go back to sleep sometimes. It's just thinking of my family members, of all the things that are going on in the world, the suffering of people, and that God loves all people.
Mm-hmm. What are things that you wish that younger people understood about the stage of life that you're in? What are things you wish that younger people understood?
That's kind of hard because I feel the young people in our church, the younger people, they do well in where they're at, and they all have this desire, but there's always room for learning more.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't. There's lots of people that I wish they could understand more about God and how God works.
Mm-hmm. Well, what would you have wished you would have understood when you were younger about where you are now? What are things maybe that you didn't when you were younger, you thought it would be one way, and now that you're older, you see it differently?
Okay. One thing I often think about is, for we know that all things work together for good to them that love God. And I always thought, well, there's a purpose in everything, and that if we live right, then we'll be blessed. And but now it's more a mystery, I guess you would say, or how shall I say this? That it's just different from what it was when I was younger. I felt that, well, I remember when my sister-in-law was killed, my brother said, well, that was God's will. Well, I think God wants us all to have a good life. He does not want people to be killed. You know, if that would be true, and a lot of this I learned when being in the refugee camp, of people saying, was it God's will that all of us Salvadorians, so many of them were killed? They all had people and said, we love God. Was it God's will that we should be killed? What about this typhoon that hit the Philippines? Was it God's will that 10,000 people should die? Or is it, sometimes I think mankind has more to do than what we sometimes realize of how we take care of God's creation.
Yeah.
We're misusing God's creation, and that's why some of these things happen. Global warming and all of those things. And that's what I'm thankful for too, that I think our people in our church, a lot of them do realize that and have that desire to try, but there's always room for improvement.
Well, another question I had, the same, I guess we'll ask you a couple, but I'll start with the one I asked Marianne about. How has your relationship with the church changed over time? Maybe that matches the answer. I'll ask it like that. How has your relationship with the church changed over time?
Of course, I went from Amish to the Mennonite. Well, all along, there's a little bit of a different understanding of who God is. But I think I have always had this desire of living close to God. So that hasn't changed, but I'm still learning. And
as far as being a part of a faith community, though, that's been something that's been important to you throughout your life?
oh, that's been important to me throughout my life. Very important, yeah. That I wanted to be a part of the family of God, wherever. And of course, some people feel I'm over the brink. That's where I'm at. But,
Well,
Would now like to introduce to you Marianne Mertens. Marianne grew up in Toledo, Ohio, but moved to Oklahoma after a pretty extraordinary turn of events. I wish I could tell it as well as her late husband could, but basically the story is that she responded to a personal ad in a Catholic newspaper by Art Mertens, the man who had become her husband. Art, as it turns out, was a former Trappist monk of 10 years who had left the monastery because, and to quote him, it was becoming too materialistic. He then married a woman and they adopted 2 children together. Unfortunately, 4 years later, she passed away very unexpectedly. And so Art, being the practical man that he was, placed an ad in a Catholic newspaper. My understanding was one of the first, I think maybe the only ad that this personal ad of this nature they ever ran in this newspaper, but placed the ad that said he was looking for a woman to join him and his family in living a simple lifestyle of prayer and service to the poor in Oklahoma City. So after a time of correspondence and a visit, and I understand there are several women that visited actually, but Marianne in the end decided that she would marry Art, which resulted in a beautiful marriage of 37 years. Art and Marianne had 2 more children, and they lived a full, enriched life centered on ministry to the poor and those who were hurting. I got to know Art and Marianne through the peace movement. They were close friends with Moses and Sadie and could always be counted on to provide hospitality to those in need. They were devoted to their Catholic faith, but not necessarily to the popes and the hierarchy. But for them, it was about the spirit of the faith, especially the radical saints. I should add, unofficial as of yet, saints like Oscar Romero and Dorothy Day. A few years ago, Art was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. and his last few years were difficult to say the least. He went from being the most cheerful man I've ever known to being angry and at times combative. This was hard for everyone that knew him to take. He was a gentle, gentle person. In fact, one of the things I remember best about him was he made the most wonderful homemade bread. I think he learned how to make it in the monastery, but it was phenomenal bread. Just a loving, gentle person. And so when the Alzheimer's came into his brain, he changed so dramatically. And it got so bad that he had to be placed in a nursing home. And finally, mercifully, he passed away in 2010. Marianne was shook terribly, and I don't think I can possibly describe her journey of grief. Those who have been around her have seen glimpses of it, but I can't imagine it, really. But I can also say that despite this monumental, terrible sadness, Marianne's faith has remained strong, and yet it has changed, as you'll see from this interview.
I don't say many written prayers anymore. I do a lot of meditation and just, you might say, being with God.
How has that changed since from what your spiritual practice when you were younger compared to now? What's
Well,
different? What's the same?
I was so messed up when I was younger. And I remember praying for balance. And then I think that is a good thing to encourage people to do, because as I did that, my life did take on balance. But recently, you know, and when I was younger, I asked for a lot of things too. I don't ask for that much anymore, just to keep going. But like I say, it's not saying prayers as much as being with God. And what was the other thing?
And then what are things you wished that younger people understood about the stage of life you're in, or the time of your spiritual journey that you're in?
Well, I sort of wish sometimes that they realize that old people are capable of thinking. Somebody was saying to me, I know where it was. This woman was saying that her daughter or granddaughter or somebody read some book and was just taken with it, and was explaining it in elementary terms to her, and she said, I couldn't tell her, but I thought like that a long time ago. And sometimes young people, I don't think, give older people credit for thinking, or at least thinking outside the box, or having different. That's one thing. And I see a lot of young people. I wish they would pray for balance, because they don't know what's wrong in their life, and I think they'd be a lot happier if they did.
I know it's something I need to pray for a lot more.
It really helped.
Now, how old were you when you started praying for balance?
I don't really know.
Like in your 20s or 30s?
20s or 30s, late 20s, early 30s. Because I was figuring that things weren't going well, and that I don't know where that came from. And also, I've told a lot of people this, and it's true. The best thing I ever did, and I don't remember, it was long before I came down here and got married. Somebody told me, I had a lot of trouble with my stepmother. She was unbalanced, and it was terrible. Somebody told me to pray for her every day, and that's the best thing I ever did in my life, because it freed me and gave me a different attitude. I realized how wounded she was. And that's something I'd like to tell people, that if they have something or somebody in their life that they just can't get rid of or free from, to pray for that situation every day. And I think that way it can be resolved.
Okay. Well, I have one more question.
Okay.
I was curious, as far as different, compared to in the past, how has your relationship with the church changed? Is it, how has that evolved over time? I guess the short version of it. I'm sure there's a lot you can say.
Well, not bound by the church. In short. Not tied to a church. And it's been sort of my, you take a little from this and a little from that. It's not that you don't have loyalty, but sometimes if you stick in one place, you are stuck.
Yeah.
So that's my opinion, and that's
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
To conclude this presentation, I wanted to share a little bit about a specific spiritual practice that is engaged by Sadie and Marianne in the video, but also by a good number of other local peace activists. All of them actually, they would qualify as being elders. And this is something that began during the initial invasion of Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks. And initially there was a yearning among participants that we need to pray for peace. And one of the participants, a lady named Phyllis Byerly, a Quaker woman, also in her, she may be close to 90 if I remember right. But Phyllis had suggested that, well, why don't we pray in the style of the Quakers? And that idea everyone liked, so that's what they've done now. And this has been going on now for, I think, over 10 years, of gathering every Friday, normally from 12:15 to 12:45 p.m. And what they do, they meet at the Mennonite church. They sit in a circle. They light a candle, that part's a little untraditional for Quakers. They light a candle as a point of focus. Someone will traditionally read a short devotional thought, and then the participants settle into silence. They just sit for about 30 minutes. Sometimes they'll have their eyes closed, sometimes their eyes be open and focus on the candle. But during that time is a time of being silent in the presence of the divine, seeking to hear from God, seeking to connect with God. At the end of the time, they join hands, and then maybe there'll be verbal things they want to share that came out of that time of reflection. For any folks out there who are Quakers, this is a little bit modified a traditional form, but I wanted to share this because I think it's a powerful, sustaining thing. It has kept the participants of this group going in some pretty dark times in our nation's history. They have found through this practice the means to keep on keeping on, to continue working for peace. And they've also found a great deal of peace in themselves through this. Phyllis, I know she told me once that when she was younger, she sought to be doing. But as she's grown older, she's realized it's more important to be. And it's the being that's most important. And this practice of silent meditative prayer, contemplative prayer, is a good way of connecting with that kind of being. That said, I've tried it. I participate occasionally. It's a struggle for me to sit still for 30 minutes. It's a struggle to be present. When I do go, I'm really glad I go. It's a powerful thing. It's not easy. So my challenge to viewers, both at Joy and in my class, is to consider trying this out sometime. You can do it by yourself, lighting a candle, finding some other point of focus, and sitting normally in an upright posture, not slouched over, but sitting up. And then sometimes it helps begin by just taking some deep breaths, and then to focus on being present before God. That said, I think it's a much more powerful experience if you can do it in community with others, with 2, 3, 4 people, or even more. Joining together and doing this is a really powerful thing. So I want to thank you for watching this video, and I hope that the words of Sadie, of Marianne, will spur you on to listen to the other elders in your life and to learn what we can from them and to experience the ministry they have to offer us. Thank you.